I arrived at my husband's sister's wedding in a silk dress and borrowed composure, carrying a small silver gift box I had wrapped myself that morning. The ballroom entrance glowed with candles, white roses, and polished smiles. For one foolish second, I thought maybe all the tension of the past few weeks had been a misunderstanding. Then I gave my name. The girl at the check-in table froze. She checked the list once, then twice, then looked up at me with the kind of pity that makes your skin go cold. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your name isn't here." I laughed at first, because surely there had been a mistake. So I called my husband. Music thundered behind him when he answered. "Ethan," I said. "They're saying I'm not invited." He didn't even lower his voice. "Luna," he said, almost amused. "You really thought you were invited?" An hour later, his sister opened my gift and started screaming. For a moment, I just stood there in the hotel lobby, holding my phone like it had suddenly become heavier than it should be. Around me, guests drifted toward the ballroom doors in shimmering dresses and tailored suits. Someone laughed near the bar. A violin quartet played softly by the staircase. Everything about the evening looked elegant, warm, celebratory. Except for the fact that I, Ethan Cole's wife, was apparently not invited. I cleared my throat and leaned slightly closer to the check-in table. "Could you check again?" I asked gently. "Luna Cole." "Maybe it's under my husband's name?" The young woman nodded nervously and flipped through the pages once more. Her finger traced the list slowly. Then she looked up again with the same uncomfortable expression. "I'm really sorry," she said. "Your name isn't listed under any of the Cole family reservations." The words settled between us like something fragile breaking. Behind me, another guest stepped forward, and the receptionist immediately brightened. "Good evening. Welcome to Madison and Daniel's wedding." I stepped aside so they could pass. My phone was still in my hand. Ethan's call had already ended, but his words echoed louder than the music filling the lobby. "You really thought you were invited?" For a long time, I had learned how to ignore that tone in his voice, the dismissive edge, the quiet way he made everything sound like my misunderstanding. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt final. I turned toward the large glass doors leading to the ballroom. Through them, I could see the reception space glowing under crystal chandeliers. Round tables draped in ivory linen stretched across the room. White orchids cascaded from tall centerpieces. Madison had always loved dramatic entrances. Even from the hallway, I could hear her voice somewhere inside, bright and confident, greeting guests like she owned the entire building. I swallowed and looked down at the small silver box in my hands. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a jewelry case. A white ribbon crossed neatly over the lid. Inside were a few pieces of paper. Just paper. Nothing that looked particularly dramatic. And yet I knew once Madison opened it, nothing about tonight would remain the same. The receptionist shifted awkwardly beside me. "Ma'am, would you like me to call someone from the wedding party?" I almost smiled. Call someone? Who exactly would they call? My husband? The man who had just laughed at the idea of me being here? "No," I said softly. "That won't be necessary." I walked toward the long gift table set near the ballroom entrance. It was already covered with beautifully wrapped boxes, elegant envelopes, and towering arrangements of flowers. Compared to the others, my little silver box looked almost invisible. Perfect. I placed it carefully between two larger packages and adjusted the ribbon so the card faced upward. To Madison. Congratulations. Luna. No drama. No accusations. Just my name. For a second, I hesitated. A small voice inside me whispered that I could still walk away differently. I could pick up the gift. I could leave without letting any of this unfold. I could keep protecting people who had never once protected me. But then I remembered Ethan's voice on the phone. "You really thought you were invited?" Something inside my chest settled into place. I turned and began walking toward the exit. The violin music faded behind me as the lobby doors slid open. Outside, the evening air was cool and sharp against my skin. A taxi waited near the curb. The driver glanced up as I approached. "Airport?" I nodded. "Yes, please." As the car pulled away from the glowing hotel entrance, I looked back once through the rear window. Inside that ballroom, Madison was probably raising a champagne glass right now, basking in attention, believing tonight was the perfect beginning of her perfect life. She had no idea that a small silver box was waiting for her on the gift table. And she definitely had no idea what was inside it. I leaned back against the seat and silenced my phone. Because when my sister-in-law opened that gift later tonight, she was going to start calling me, over and over again. And I had absolutely no intention of answering. People always assume moments like that happen suddenly. That one cruel phone call, one argument, one dramatic scene breaks everything apart. But the truth is, the night I stood outside Madison's wedding wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the moment I finally stopped pretending there wasn't one. When I first met Ethan Cole 5 years earlier, he seemed like the kindest man I had ever known. He held doors open, remembered small details about my day, and laughed in a warm, easy way that made the world feel lighter. He also adored his family. At the time, I thought that was a good sign. "Madison is my little sister," he told me on our third date. "She's a lot sometimes, but family is everything to us." I smiled and said the polite thing. "That's nice." I had no idea what a lot actually meant. The first time I met the Cole family was at a Thanksgiving dinner in Charleston. Their house looked like something out of a magazine, 3 stories of white columns, tall windows, and polished floors that reflected the chandelier light. Denise Cole, Ethan's mother, greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "So this is Luna," she said, studying me carefully. "Ethan told us you work with numbers?" "I'm a financial compliance consultant," I explained. "Mostly for nonprofits and educational foundations." Her smile tightened slightly. "How practical." It wasn't an insult, exactly. But it also wasn't approval. Then Madison swept into the room. She was already dressed like the star of the evening, wearing a silk blouse and diamond earrings that sparkled every time she turned her head. "You must be Luna," she said brightly. "Ethan said you're the organized one." I laughed politely. "I suppose that's one way to describe it." Madison tilted her head. "That's good," she said. "Every family needs someone responsible." Something about the way she said it made the room feel a little colder. Over the next few years, I slowly learned how the Cole family worked. Madison was the center of gravity. If she wanted something, the entire household shifted around her. If she made a mistake, someone else quietly fixed it, usually me. Once, she asked me to look over some paperwork for a charity gala she was organizing. The receipts didn't match the invoices. Thousands of dollars were missing. When I pointed it out, Madison waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, that's just temporary. I moved some funds around." "That's not how nonprofit accounts work," I said carefully. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table. "Luna," he murmured, "don't make it a big deal. It always ended the same way." Madison smiling sweetly. Ethan asking me to be understanding, and me being told I was too serious. The truth was, I wasn't serious. I was careful, because my job required it. For 8 years, I had worked in forensic accounting and compliance reviews for nonprofit organizations. My job was to follow paper trails, verify funding sources, and make sure charitable money went exactly where it was supposed to go. Most people thought it sounded boring, but I knew better. Money always told a story, and sometimes that story wasn't the one people wanted told. The Evelyn Cole Scholars Fund had been created by Ethan's grandmother before she passed away. It was a beautiful idea. Each year, the fund provided college scholarships to young women from low-income families across South Carolina. Madison loved talking about it at parties. "Our family believes in empowering women," she would say, raising a champagne glass. The donors adored her. The press loved her speeches. And for a long time, I believed in it too, until the day the numbers stopped making sense. It happened about 2 months before the wedding. Grace Holloway, the fund's board director, called me one afternoon. "Luna," she said gently, "you have experience reviewing nonprofit finances, right?" "Yes." "We've had some accounting irregularities," she explained. "Nothing dramatic, but a few expense reports look unusual." "Send them to me," I said. I expected small mistakes, clerical errors, misfiled invoices. Instead, I found something else entirely. Large transfers labeled event reimbursement, luxury vendor deposits, floral design invoices, private catering contracts, and every single one of them had been paid from the scholarship fund. My stomach dropped when I recognized the vendor names. They were all connected to Madison's upcoming wedding. I confronted Ethan that night. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through seating arrangements on his tablet. "Ethan," I said quietly, setting the printed reports on the coffee table. "Why is Madison paying wedding vendors from the scholarship fund?" He barely glanced at the papers. "She's not paying," he said. "She's borrowing." "Borrowing?" She'll put it back after the wedding, he replied casually. Relax. I stared at him. That money isn't hers to borrow. It's family money, Ethan said. No, I said slowly. It's scholarship money. For the first time, Ethan's expression hardened. You're blowing this out of proportion. I folded my arms. And if I report it to the board? He leaned back against the couch, studying me like I was the problem. Then you're going to ruin Madison's wedding. The room fell silent. And that was the moment I realized something I had been avoiding for years. Ethan wasn't ignoring the truth. He was protecting the lie. 3 days later, Madison called me. Her voice was sweet as honey. Luna, I heard you've been asking questions about the wedding expenses. Yes, I said calmly. She sighed dramatically. You always have to make things complicated. Madison, if you can't support your own family, she interrupted, maybe you shouldn't come to the wedding. I thought she was bluffing. I thought Ethan would never allow it. But apparently, I had misunderstood both of them. Because 2 months later, I stood in a hotel lobby holding a silver gift box. And my husband had just confirmed I was not invited. What Madison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already stopped trying to convince them. Instead, I had started preparing something else entirely. The night after Ethan told me to relax, I didn't sleep. Not because I was angry, because I was certain. In my line of work, instincts mattered. When you spent years tracing financial records and investigating irregularities, you developed a quiet alarm system in your head, and mine was screaming. So the next morning, I opened my laptop and began going through every document Grace had sent me. Invoices, transfer confirmations, expense reports. At first glance, everything looked legitimate. The paperwork had been carefully organized, neatly labeled, professionally formatted, which, ironically, made it more suspicious. Real nonprofit spending is messy. Receipts don't always line up perfectly. Someone always forgets a signature or mislabels a reimbursement. But this was too clean. I zoomed in on one of the transaction logs. Vendor: Charleston Floral Atelier. Amount: $28,450. Category: Educational Event Decor. Educational Event Decor. I almost laughed out loud. The attached invoice included detailed descriptions of cascading orchids, imported peonies, and a custom floral arch. Not exactly the kind of thing a scholarship seminar required. Then I opened another file. Vendor: Velour Catering Group. Amount: $42,900. Description: Donor Appreciation Dinner. Except, the event date matched Madison's wedding rehearsal dinner. My stomach tightened. I kept going. Cake designer. Lighting company. Live band. Every single payment had one thing in common. They all traced back to the Evelyn Cole Scholars Fund. And every single authorization line carried the same digital signature. Mine. I froze. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Because I knew exactly what that meant. Someone had copied my authorization credentials. I called Grace immediately. Grace, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Did the board approve any of these wedding-related expenses? Silence crackled on the line. What wedding expenses? I closed my eyes briefly. Madison's wedding, I said. Grace inhaled sharply. Luna, those transfers were approved under your compliance authorization. No, I replied quietly. They weren't. Another long silence. Then Grace spoke again, her voice lower now. Are you saying someone forged your credentials? I'm saying, I replied carefully, someone used them without my permission. And you know who? I didn't answer right away. But we both knew. That evening, I confronted Ethan again. This time, I placed the full report in front of him. All of it, I said. Every transfer. He scanned the pages briefly before pushing them aside. You're still on this? They used my authorization code. So it's fraud, Ethan. His jaw tightened. Don't say that word. But that's what it is. He stood up slowly. Madison needed the money temporarily. The fund has plenty. That fund pays for girls to go to college, I said quietly. Girls who can't afford tuition. And they'll still get it, he snapped. After the wedding. I stared at him. You knew. He didn't deny it. Instead, he rubbed his temples like I was exhausting him. Luna, you work with numbers all day. Sometimes you forget real life isn't that rigid. Real life. I almost laughed. Real life, I repeated softly. Doesn't include stealing from scholarship funds. Ethan's patience finally cracked. For God's sake, Luna, he said sharply. It's Madison's wedding. The way he said it made everything painfully clear. Not our family's responsibility. Not the students who depended on that money. Just Madison. Always Madison. I took a deep breath. So what happens if the board audits the fund? They won't, Ethan said immediately. How do you know? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked at me in a way I had never seen before. Cold, calculating. You wouldn't report your own family, he said quietly. The sentence hung in the air between us. A challenge. Or maybe a warning. I might, I said. Ethan's expression hardened. You'd destroy Madison. No, I replied softly. Madison did that herself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan sighed heavily and picked up his tablet again like the conversation bored him. Just let the wedding happen, he said. After that, we'll fix everything. I watched him for a long time. And that was the moment I understood something important. Ethan didn't think what Madison had done was wrong. He just thought getting caught would be inconvenient. 3 days later, Madison called me. Her voice sounded bright and sugary. Luna, she said. I heard you've been digging through fund records. Yes. A soft laugh drifted through the phone. You always did love paperwork. Madison, I just wanted to give you some advice, she interrupted smoothly. What advice? If you're planning to make a scene about this, don't come to the wedding. The line went quiet. I waited for her to clarify. To say she was joking. She didn't. You're uninviting me? I asked slowly. I'm protecting my day, Madison replied lightly. And Ethan agrees? Another pause. Of course he does. Something inside my chest settled into a strange, calm stillness. All right, I said. Madison sounded surprised. That's it? Yes. She laughed again. I knew you'd be reasonable. Reasonable? I almost thanked her for the compliment. Instead, I said, congratulations on the wedding, and hung up. That night, I sat at my desk staring at the scholarship fund documents spread across the table. Every transfer. Every fake authorization. Every dollar that should have gone to a student instead paying for orchids and champagne. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt clear. And when clarity comes, decisions become simple. So I picked up my phone and called someone Ethan and Madison had clearly forgotten existed. A lawyer. Because if Madison wanted a perfect wedding, she was about to receive the most unforgettable gift of her life. The next morning, I didn't call Ethan. I didn't call Madison either. Instead, I called someone who understood consequences. Naomi Bennett's office, a calm voice answered. Yes, I said. I'd like to schedule a consultation. Naomi Bennett's office overlooked the Charleston harbor. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, and the afternoon sunlight reflected across the water like a sheet of glass. She was exactly the kind of lawyer people trusted with uncomfortable truths, precise, composed, and almost unnervingly calm. She listened without interrupting as I explained everything. The scholarship fund, the transfers, the digital signature, and the wedding. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk. So, Naomi said quietly, your husband and his sister used charitable funds for personal expenses. Yes. And your authorization credentials were used without permission. Yes. She leaned back in her chair. That's serious. I nodded. I know. Naomi studied me for a moment. Before we discuss legal options, I want to ask you something, she said. All right. Do you want revenge? The question hung in the room. For a second, I imagined the easy version of revenge. Public accusations. Online scandals. A dramatic confrontation in the middle of the wedding reception. But the truth was, that wasn't what I wanted. No, I said slowly. Naomi raised an eyebrow. You don't? I want the scholarship fund protected, I replied. And I want the students who depend on it to be safe. She nodded once. That's a much stronger position legally. I exhaled. Good. Over the next 2 hours, Naomi and I worked through every possible step. First, we contacted Grace Holloway from the funds board. Grace sounded shaken but grateful. If what you found is accurate, she said, we need to freeze those accounts immediately. That's the plan, Naomi replied. By the end of the meeting, 3 things had been prepared. First, an independent forensic audit report documenting the financial transfers. Second, a temporary legal order freezing the fund accounts connected to the suspicious transactions. And third, something I hadn't expected. Naomi slid a printed document across the desk. This clause was written into the fund charter by Mrs. Evelyn Cole herself, she explained. I read the line twice. Then a third time. In the event of financial misconduct or mismanagement, I read aloud, temporary financial oversight may be transferred to an independent compliance advisor selected by the board. Naomi smiled faintly. The board has already voted. I looked up. Voted? You. For a moment, I couldn't speak. You're now the temporary compliance supervisor for the Evelyn Cole Scholars Fund, Naomi said. My throat tightened slightly. Madison had spent years telling everyone she would someday run the fund. Instead, the responsibility had quietly landed in my hands. But that wasn't the only thing I did that afternoon. When Naomi finished printing the legal documents, I took out my checkbook. She looked at me curiously. What are you doing? I began writing numbers. Large ones. Those are payments, I said. For what? The wedding vendors. Naomi frowned slightly. You're not responsible for those. I know, but you're paying them anyway? Yes. She leaned forward. Why? I placed the completed check beside the documents. Because the florist, the musicians, the cake designer, they didn't steal scholarship money. Naomi considered that for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. That's surprisingly kind. It's not kindness, I said quietly. It's fairness. Before I left her office, Naomi handed me a small stack of documents. The audit report, the legal freeze order, the fund oversight letter, copies for the board, and finally, the check I had written. All of it fit neatly into a slim folder. On the way home, I stopped at a small boutique gift shop. The owner showed me several elegant boxes, but one caught my eye immediately. A polished silver gift box with a simple white ribbon. Small, quiet, almost delicate, perfect. That night, I placed the documents inside. The audit report on top. The legal order beneath it. Then, the letter confirming the board's decision. And finally, my personal check to cover the vendor costs. Before closing the lid, I added one last piece of paper. Just a single handwritten note. 5 words. Scholarships are not wedding decorations. I tied the ribbon carefully and attached a small card. To Madison. Congratulations. Luna. 2 days later, Madison called again. Her voice sounded bright and cheerful. Just confirming you got my message earlier this week, she said lightly. I did. Good, she replied. I'm glad we understand each other. Yes, I said calmly. There was a brief pause. Then Madison laughed softly. You've always been reasonable, Luna. Reasonable. I almost smiled. Yes, I said. I suppose I have. After we hung up, I looked at the small silver box sitting on my kitchen counter. Madison thought she had protected her wedding. She thought she had removed the one person who might cause trouble. But she had misunderstood something important. I wasn't planning to cause trouble. I was planning to deliver the truth. And the truth, unlike me, had definitely been invited to her wedding. By the time Madison walked down the aisle, I was already sitting in an airport lounge 30 miles away. The television above the bar played muted news coverage, while travelers drifted in and out with rolling suitcases and tired expressions. No one there knew anything about the wedding happening across the city. And that was fine with me. I sat near the window with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the runway lights flicker on as evening settled over Charleston. My phone rested on the table in front of me, silent. For now. Across town, the reception would be starting soon. I could almost picture it perfectly. Madison standing in the center of the ballroom beneath 1,000 tiny lights, her white gown spread around her like something out of a magazine. Guests clinking glasses, cameras flashing. Denise proudly greeting donors and friends. Richard shaking hands with business partners. And Ethan probably believed the worst part of the evening was already over. He thought removing me from the guest list had solved the problem. He had no idea the real moment of truth hadn't happened yet. At the Grand Belmont Hotel, the reception hall glittered under towering crystal chandeliers. Later, Grace would describe it to me in quiet detail. The room was beautiful, she told me over the phone days later. Madison made a speech about family tradition and philanthropy. The donors loved it. That part didn't surprise me. Madison had always been excellent at speeches. She raised a glass and spoke about the legacy of the Evelyn Cole Scholars Fund, thanking the family for their commitment to empowering young women. Grace said people even applauded. And then came the moment every wedding eventually reaches. The gift table. Someone from the wedding party suggested the couple open a few gifts for the guests before dessert. Madison loved the idea. Of course she did. She stood beside Daniel, her new husband, while the photographer snapped pictures and the guests gathered closer to watch. Wrapped boxes were passed forward one at a time. A crystal vase, a silver serving tray, an envelope with a generous check from one of Richard's business partners. Madison smiled brightly for every photo. "Thank you," she said over and over. Then the event coordinator reached for a smaller package. A silver box tied with a white ribbon. The card attached to the top caught Madison's eye immediately. Grace told me Madison's smile faltered for just a second when she read the name. From Luna. A few guests nearby murmured softly. Madison quickly recovered. "Well," she said lightly, lifting the box so the guests could see it. "At least she managed to send something." A few people laughed politely. Grace said Ethan was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching quietly. Madison untied the ribbon, lifted the lid, and froze. At first, she didn't say anything. Her eyes moved quickly across the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Grace said. Madison's face slowly lost all color. "What is it?" Denise asked from beside the table. Madison didn't answer. Instead, she flipped to the next document. And that's when the room began to change. The cheerful chatter faded. The band stopped playing mid-song. Someone whispered, "What's wrong?" Madison suddenly slammed the papers down onto the table. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. Daniel leaned closer. "Madison?" She grabbed the top sheet again, her voice rising. "This is fake." Grace stepped forward through the small crowd. "Madison," she said carefully, "what exactly are you looking at?" Madison held up the document with shaking hands. A legal seal glinted under the ballroom lights. Across the top of the page were the words, "Temporary Financial Freeze Order." The room went completely silent. Denise blinked. "What does that mean?" Madison's voice cracked slightly. It means someone is accusing the fund of financial misconduct." Several donors in the crowd exchanged uneasy looks. Richard stepped closer to the table. "Let me see that." He read the page quickly. Then his expression darkened. "Where did this come from?" Madison flipped to the next document. The forensic audit report. Grace recognized it instantly. She inhaled sharply. This is the independent review request we filed." Madison stared at her. "You filed this?" Grace looked uncomfortable. "No," she said quietly. "Luna did." The name moved through the room like a sudden cold wind. Ethan stepped forward now, grabbing the papers from Madison's hands. He scanned them rapidly. And the color drained from his face the same way it had from his sister's. "What is it?" Daniel asked again. Ethan didn't answer, because the next document in the stack made the situation even worse. A formal letter from the fund's board. Grace read it aloud slowly. "Effective immediately. Luna Brooks Cole has been appointed Temporary Financial Compliance Supervisor for the Evelyn Cole Scholars Fund pending the completion of the audit investigation." Madison's mouth opened. "No," she whispered. Grace looked up. "Yes." Madison shook her head violently. "No, that's impossible." But there was still one final paper left in the box. Madison grabbed it with trembling fingers. It wasn't a legal document. It was a check, a personal check. The amount was large enough that several people nearby gasped when they saw it. Daniel frowned. "What is that for?" Grace answered softly. "For the wedding vendors." Madison stared at the note attached to the check. 5 simple words written in Luna's handwriting. "Scholarships are not wedding decorations." For several seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. Then Madison finally found her voice, and she screamed my name. I didn't hear Madison scream my name, but later, more than one person described the moment the same way. The ballroom had been silent for several seconds after the last paper was read. Guests stared at the documents spread across the gift table, trying to understand what they were seeing. Then Madison's composure shattered. "Luna!" she shouted, her voice cracking through the room. "What is this?" The sound echoed against the high ceilings. Daniel stepped back slightly, confusion written all over his face. "Madison, calm down. What exactly is going on?" But Madison was no longer interested in calming down. She snatched the audit report from the table and waved it in the air. "This is a lie," she yelled. "She's trying to ruin my wedding." Grace stepped forward again, her voice steady despite the tension building in the room. "No," she said quietly. "She's documenting the financial activity connected to the scholarship fund." Richard turned sharply toward her. Grace, he said in a low voice, are you saying this report is legitimate? Grace hesitated for only a moment. Yes. The word landed like a stone in water. Ripples of whispers spread across the crowd. Several donors who supported the Evelyn Cole Scholars Fund had already stepped closer, reading the headings printed on the documents. One of them, a gray-haired man named Mr. Landry, frowned deeply. These transfers, he said slowly, pointing at the page. They're marked as donor-funded scholarship allocations. Grace nodded. That's correct. And they were used for wedding vendors? He asked. No one answered, because the evidence was lying right there on the table. Floral arrangements, lighting installations, catering deposits, thousands and thousands of dollars that were supposed to fund college tuition. Madison's hands began shaking. She was helping with the accounting. Madison snapped suddenly, pointing toward the documents. She had access to everything. She could have written these reports herself. Ethan stepped forward quickly. Madison, but Grace shook her head. The audit was performed by an independent firm, she said firmly. Not Luna. Madison stared at her like she had just spoken another language. That's impossible. Grace pointed to the second page. The report includes system logs. Ethan froze. Grace continued reading. Authorization credentials connected to the transfers originated from a residential IP address. She looked up slowly. The Cole residence. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Daniel turned toward Madison. Your house? He asked quietly. Madison's eyes darted toward Ethan. And, in that moment, the entire room understood something she had never intended to reveal. Because Madison said the worst possible thing she could have said. You told me she would never go this far. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Too late. Richard's head snapped toward him. You knew about this? His father demanded. Ethan's jaw tightened. I was trying to handle it quietly. Handle it? Denise repeated, stunned. Madison's breathing had become uneven. She was supposed to stay quiet, Madison cried. She's always the reasonable one. Grace looked at her carefully. Reasonable doesn't mean silent. Another donor stepped closer to the table. A woman named Margaret Chen who had personally funded 2 scholarships the previous year. Are you telling us, Margaret asked slowly, that money donated for students was used to pay for this wedding? Grace answered without hesitation. That is what the investigation is determining. The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers. Daniel stepped away from Madison entirely now, staring at the documents like they might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. This can't be real, he muttered. Madison grabbed his arm desperately. Daniel, listen to me, this is just Luna being dramatic. But Daniel gently pulled his arm free. Madison, these are court-stamped documents. Madison's composure cracked again. She grabbed her phone and began dialing frantically. Across the room, Ethan pulled out his own phone. My phone. Back at the airport, I watched the runway lights blink through the glass as my phone suddenly began vibrating across the table. Ethan. I didn't answer. It rang again almost immediately. Madison. I turned the phone over so the screen faced down. Another call. And another. Within minutes, the screen lit up with a flood of missed calls. Madison. Ethan. Denise. I could imagine exactly what was happening inside that ballroom. The donors demanding explanations. Grace confirming the audit. The realization spreading across the room that the story Madison had told everyone about family legacy and charity was beginning to collapse. My phone buzzed again. This time, a text message appeared. From Naomi. The accounts are officially frozen. The board has secured the fund. No scholarship money will be lost. I exhaled slowly, tension leaving my shoulders for the first time in weeks. That had been the only outcome that truly mattered. The students were protected. The rest? The rest was simply consequence. My phone vibrated again. Another call from Madison. I watched it ring until the screen went dark. Because for years I had answered every call from that family. Every demand. Every accusation. Every expectation that I would quietly fix their problems. Tonight was the first time I didn't. And strangely enough, it was the first time I felt completely free. 3 days after the wedding, Ethan finally stopped calling. Instead, he showed up at my apartment. I knew he would eventually. People like Ethan didn't believe in endings. They believed in negotiations. It was late afternoon when the knock came. I opened the door and found him standing in the hallway looking exhausted, his tie loose and his hair slightly disheveled like he hadn't slept properly in days. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled sharply. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. Ethan walked into the living room slowly, looking around like the space suddenly felt unfamiliar. The apartment was quiet, sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor. No raised voices, no chaos, just stillness. "Coffee?" I asked politely. He shook his head. "I didn't come for coffee." I assumed that. He ran a hand over his face before turning toward me. "Luna, what you did at the wedding." "I wasn't at the wedding," I said calmly. His jaw tightened. "You know what I mean." "Yes," I replied. "I do." For a few seconds, he paced the room, clearly trying to decide how to start the conversation. Finally, he stopped in front of me. "You could have handled this privately." The sentence didn't surprise me. In fact, I had expected it. "I tried," I said quietly. Ethan frowned. "When?" "The night I showed you the financial reports." His eyes flickered slightly. "You didn't listen." "That's not fair," he said quickly. "I was trying to keep things from blowing up." "By ignoring fraud?" He winced at the word again. "Don't say it like that. How would you prefer I say it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice like he was explaining something simple to a stubborn child. "Madison made a mistake. That's all. She was under pressure planning the wedding." "A mistake," I repeated slowly. "Yes. She used scholarship money meant for students. We were going to replace it. You used my authorization credentials." Ethan rubbed his temples. "You're making it sound criminal." I looked at him quietly. "That's because it is." The silence that followed stretched longer than either of us expected. Finally, Ethan sighed. "The board froze the accounts, Luna. The investigation has already started." "Do you realize what that's going to do to this family?" I held his gaze. "Yes. And you're okay with that?" I took a slow breath before answering. "I'm okay with protecting the students that fund was meant to help." Ethan stared at me like he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. "You chose them over your own family." "No," I said gently. "I chose what was right." His voice sharpened. "You're acting like Madison is some kind of criminal." "I'm acting like actions have consequences." Ethan shook his head. "You've always been like this, so rigid, so uncompromising." For a moment, I almost smiled. "You used to call that integrity." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out at the street below. "Madison's wedding turned into a disaster," he muttered. "Half the donors walked out. Daniel's parents are furious. The press has started asking questions about the fund." I listened quietly. "And you're telling me," he continued, turning back toward me, "that none of that matters to you?" What surprised me wasn't the accusation. It was the realization that Ethan truly believed it. "That's not what I'm saying," I replied. "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying," I answered slowly, "that this didn't start with me." Ethan crossed his arms. "So what now?" The question hung between us. For years, I had shaped my life around that word, us. But, standing there in the quiet apartment, I finally understood something I had been avoiding for far too long. There hadn't been an us for a very long time. Only expectations. Only compromises that went in one direction. I walked to the small table beside the couch and picked up a folder. Inside were the documents Naomi had prepared earlier that morning. I handed them to him. Ethan looked down. His expression changed instantly. "Luna, what is this?" "Divorce papers." The room fell silent. He stared at the folder like it might disappear if he blinked. "You're serious?" "Yes." "You're ending our marriage over this?" I met his eyes. "No." "Then what?" "I'm ending it because when you had a choice between protecting the truth and protecting your sister's lie," I paused. "You chose the lie." Ethan looked like he wanted to argue. But the words never came. After a long moment, he lowered the papers slowly. "You're really walking away," he said quietly. I nodded. "Yes." For the first time since he arrived, Ethan didn't try to convince me otherwise. He just stood there, staring at the floor. Eventually, he walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back once more. "You didn't have to destroy everything," he said softly. I shook my head. "I didn't destroy anything, Ethan. I opened the door. The truth did." He stepped into the hallway. And just like that, my marriage ended with the quiet click of a closing door. 6 months later, I stood in a quiet university auditorium, watching a young woman step onto the stage with tears in her eyes. Her name was Maria Alvarez. She was the first recipient of the newly restructured Evelyn Cole Scholars Fund, after the investigation was completed. Maria adjusted the microphone nervously and looked out at the audience. "I never thought I'd be able to go to college," she said softly. "My mom works 2 jobs, and for a long time we thought tuition was impossible." Her voice trembled slightly. "But this scholarship changed everything." Applause filled the room. I sat quietly in the second row, my hands folded in my lap. Moments like this were the reason the fund had existed in the first place. And now, for the first time in a long time, it was finally doing what it had been meant to do. The investigation into the wedding expenses had taken months. In the end, the results were exactly what the documents had already suggested. Funds had been improperly redirected. Financial controls had been ignored. The board required full repayment and implemented new oversight rules to prevent it from ever happening again. Madison was removed from all involvement with the scholarship fund. The wedding scandal faded from the news cycle after a few weeks, replaced by newer stories and louder headlines, but the changes it created stayed. The fund became more transparent. The donor trust slowly returned. And dozens of students Madison had never even met, received the support that money had originally been meant for. My own life changed just as much. The divorce from Ethan finalized quietly 3 months after that conversation in my apartment. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, just signatures, and the quiet understanding that some relationships end not with anger, but with clarity. I moved into a smaller apartment closer to the harbor. I slept better there. The silence felt different, lighter somehow. My friend Ava liked to joke that Ethan had banned me from a wedding and accidentally given me my freedom instead. "Not the worst trade," she said one afternoon while we sat on the balcony watching sailboats drift across the water. I laughed. "No," I admitted. "Not the worst." Sometimes people still ask me about that night, about the silver gift box, about the moment Madison opened it. They expect the story to end with revenge, with satisfaction, with the dramatic triumph of someone finally winning. But that's not how I remember it. Because the truth is, I didn't leave that gift to ruin a wedding. I left it to protect something more important. The students who depended on that scholarship fund, the vendors who deserved to be paid honestly, and maybe most of all, myself. For years I had been the reasonable one, the one who kept the peace, the one who fixed problems quietly so other people could keep their perfect image. But there's a difference between being reasonable and being silent. And the night I placed that silver box on the gift table was the moment I finally understood it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't raising your voice. It's refusing to carry someone else's lie. Before the ceremony ended, Maria stepped down from the stage and walked toward me. She held the scholarship certificate carefully in both hands. "Are you Luna?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes." She smiled through tears. "My mom told me to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," I said gently. But Maria shook her head. "Yes, I do." She hesitated for a moment before adding quietly, "If you hadn't protected the fund, I wouldn't be here." Her words stayed with me long after the auditorium emptied. Because in the end, that was the part of the story that mattered. Not the wedding, not the scandal, not even the marriage that ended. What mattered was that the truth had protected people who needed it most. And sometimes, walking away from the wrong life is the only way to build the right one.